Carly, starting in the late 18th century, the British government was very anxious to populate its maritime colonies with subjects who were loyal to the crown. What kind of offer did the British government would they have made to Highland Scots to entice them to make that journey across the island and to make their new homes in Nova Scotia?
Yeah, so just to clarify that a little bit, at the end of the 18th century, you have still a number of loyalists coming up from what was now the United States. Right. And so one thing that the British government did was people who had been in service to the crown during that conflict were given, or promised, they were promised, land grants here. So a lot of the first land grants that you see being allocated in Nova Scotia and on Cape Breton, because they were two separate colonies at this time, they were being given out to soldiers and former service personnel. That's one thing. And then there were also incentives. When people start settling here and their families start coming here, they start to share information that land is available. You can petition for land and your chances of getting it are very high. Right. And you have to compare that with what was going on in Scotland, where there would never have been a hope of people getting land, let alone 200, 300, 500 acres, which is what was on offer here. So it was a big change and a big incentive for people to come over here. Right.
I remember, this is years ago now, but hearing about advertisements being made with promises to immigrants. If you come to Nova Scotia, you'll get several head of cattle, you'll get all the farming implements you need, your seed, and so on, and a really nice rosy picture. Do I have that right, and that wasn't always the case?
So the picture was right, but that was not what was actually going to be given to people. And this letter, again, is really helpful for us because it's the Lieutenant Governor of Cape Breton at the time, 1817, writing to London saying, look, these people were made promises for agricultural implements, for seeds, for houses. Like, we can't give them any of these things because we have no money and we don't actually have instructions from the Colonial Office. So these people are expecting things that aren't available. And in fact, what they say in this letter is, we're just telling people to go and find their own country people and sort of bunk with them because they're going to be able to offer them much more support than we, the colonial administrators, can. So, and it's a very difficult thing. When somebody travels 8 weeks across the Atlantic, they're not going to turn around and go home. They're just going to have to sort of figure out a way to survive. And that's what was going on here. You get a lot of that as well with the black loyalists who came up from the United States, promised land because they were in service to the British Crown, and then they were put at the bottom of the ladder, and most of them, I don't know if most, but a lot of them didn't actually get what was promised to them. This is empire building, and there's ways to manipulate populations when you need them to settle and to become colonizers on your behalf.
Right.
Britain was brilliant at it.
Yeah. Well, we know that our McKinnon's arrived in Sydney, Cape Breton, aboard the ship, we were talking about this earlier, the William Tell, on the morning of July 24th, 1817. So I'd like to get a sense of what the priorities were for these people on arrival and during the first years of settlement.
On arrival, the priority would have been, where are we staying?
Right.
Like, where are we supposed to sleep?
Yeah.
Where are we supposed to live? What are we supposed to eat? How are we supposed to get ourselves sorted? They would have had a hope of land pretty quickly, but these things take time. And so those would have been immediate priorities. How quickly they would have been delivered is another thing. And they're in July, so they're actually arriving at a good time of the year when it's still warm enough and they can still do some exploring and seeing around to get a sense of where they were. And when we were looking at the video in your with your music, you have scenes from Barra, and it's really naked land.
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So you don't
not
have
too many trees.
no,
Yeah.
no trees. Well, there are not like we have.
Yeah.
And so what they would have also, a priority for them is how are we going to navigate forests when we have really no familiarity with this at all.
Right.
And so even building a house, you know, they were used to working with stones, and all of a sudden the main product for them was wood. How do you...
Right.
They build stone houses at first with what they can get, and then they have to transition. So there was a lot they were dealing with.
But I would expect that what helped them was the traditional fabric of Highland society. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland there is a very strong tradition. It's just what people do, which is Highland hospitality. You don't turn people away if they need help. You invite them in, you help them. This is just how the people are. And that was, of course, transferred over here. That's not something that people give up when they arrive. And so Highland hospitality played a really, really big role in helping people find their feet when they first arrived. Also just to have other people who spoke Gaelic to talk with, to pray with, to eat with, to prepare food with, to figure out how they're going to get through the next, say, the winter, for example. Right. So it was a part of the culture that was never lost. And
Right.
we were also talking, if you go to anybody's house in Cape Breton, they're going to feed you.
Yeah.
Even, I'm not Scottish, but that's part of my tradition now, right? So.
Yeah. So in this movement number 2, we see an interaction between a Mi'kmaq hunter and my ancestor, Hugh McKinnon.
Yeah.
And what is depicted in MacKinnon's Brook suite is images, or are images, of friendly cooperation between Highlanders and the Mi'kmaq. There has been much written about how, in reality, the arrival of the Highland immigrants in northern mainland Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island substantially disrupted the traditional way of life for the Mi'kmaq. Can you tell us about some of the issues that arose when 50,000 Highland settlers move into the neighborhood?
Yeah, and this is where history is doing really good work, because there has been so much over the years that has sanitized or really misrepresented the relationship between the Mi'kmaq and the incoming Highland Scots. And the fact is, the big issue is that the Highland Scots were very hungry for land. They wanted it, they didn't care who had it, and they were prepared to push anybody off who was on land they wanted. And the Mi'kmaq were systematically displaced by the Scots, and they were ruthless about it, and we can't make any excuses. So I did see that interaction on the video. It is very uncomfortable because it is inaccurate.
Yeah.
And there would have been relationships between the two groups, but the tendency to portray that in romantic terms as they helped us and we helped them, we have to kind of set that aside, and we need to look at the legacy of land theft and dislocation. And there's actual loads of evidence in the Nova Scotia archives of Highland Scots, sometimes as many as 50 or more, petitioning for Mi'kmaq land and saying, we know that they are on this land, we know that they are improving this land, but we don't care, we want it anyway. So there was very little apology for the fact that the Highland Scots, who themselves had been displaced, were coming and displacing an Indigenous population here. This is something that we have to face and deal with and then figure out. And that's where historians are working right now to figure out what do we need to do to understand this legacy and then build a path forward.
Right.
Yeah.
At the time, as I understand it, one of the studies that you gave me to have a look at, there's reference to the Mi'kmaq population of Cape Breton in the mid-1800s of being quite small, 500, compared to thousands and thousands of new immigrants from the Highlands. And one of the other things you brought to my attention was a communication that went from the Mi'kmaq elders to, I believe it was the British colonial office, about some of the issues that the Mi'kmaq were happening about these Highlanders coming in and not hunting and fishing in a sustainable way.
Yes, so I found this letter in the Colonial Office papers, and it was a letter that was sent on behalf of the Mi'kmaq to, I forget who the colonial secretary was at the time, but the Mi'kmaq are basically saying, you have to do something to control the Scots. The hunting and fishing is out of control. They're not managing the species, and we are going to be at risk because they are going to overhunt and they are going to overfish. So we talk about species conservation now, 2021. They were talking about it in the early 19th century as something that this mass influx of Scots onto the island, and I think between 1802 and 1830 or the late 1830s, there was actually 20,000 Scots, Highland Scots that arrived. That's an enormous number of people to come in and to feed, and then they are going to get their land grants. It's very, very difficult to adjust to that. And the Mi'kmaq were migrating around traditional...
Right. They weren't staying put in one place.
Yeah, because they were following the food.
Right.
But if you start to undermine the food source, that creates major problems. And so the Mi'kmaq are saying, look, this is not okay. And they're pushing back and they're advocating for their rights as people who deserve access, not just to the species, but also as protectors of the fish and animals.
Right.
So they already have they know what their custodial role is, and they're just trying to flag this to the British government.
Yeah. And did the British government listen to them?
Of course not. When did that ever happen?
Oh my.
Yeah, but it's something because people, I think, sometimes they think conservation is a very new concept, or at least in the last 30 years or so. It's not new.
Yeah.
It's not new.
Yeah. You know, when we produced this television show, it was 20 years ago. There has been, thankfully, a lot of discussion, a lot of great work done by historians such as yourself and your colleagues in this area, and there are lots of areas of history that are they're not pretty. It's not, we often idealize everything around our ancestors, the proud Highland Scots, but there were issues, there were difficulties, there were struggles, displacements in the case of the Mi'kmaq. So these are all important discussions to have.
They are, and we can link it to what we want this province to be now. We have to have a different story, but in order for that story to evolve, we need to include voices that were excluded before.
Yes.
And so history, as I was taught it, as you were taught it, it was a very white, very colonial story. And that doesn't work anymore. So we're all taking a lot of us are taking a role in that.
Right, very good. Well, on that note, let's launch into the third movement of MacKinnon's Brook Suite. And this is a movement called the Long March.